Hello YouTube, welcome back. This is part 3 of forging a bayonet. So in this episode we're going to prepare the blade to be welded to the socket. So in order to do this I need to sort out what's going on down here. Now if you remember in the last episode we forged the blade and we drew out the tang. Now the tang is overlong. I did that to make sure that I have enough stock to actually do the weld, and it's basically a good idea to have more stock than you need, and then you can cut it down to size. It's much easier than trying to add something to something that you've made too short. So now I actually left this square section here because when we go to grind the bottom of the blade and we need to remove about 5 or 6 millimeters of thickness from the blade. Again, I made that deliberately oversize. When we go to grind down the flat of the blade on the underside, we don't want to be flattening the bottom of the tang eye at the same time. This needs to stay at this thickness. So I've made that, left that square, so that I can actually use this to physically push the tang away from the bottom of the blade, which we'll be doing today. And I've got enough chunk there that it won't cause any distortion or anything like that, hopefully. So we will cut it down with an extra maybe 15, maybe 20 mil on the end, and then we will upset that back to give us a nice big fat scarf to weld onto the socket. So let's do that. So I start by shifting that tang downwards. Now I'm supporting the whole bayonet blade with a round swage, and that'll save getting any deformations in that rounded section at the top. And using a copper mallet I will just push it down and then straighten out the tang. So once that's done and the blade is cooled down, I will mark off where the blade tang transition will be, so that'll be where that rounded collar is. And I've gone a little bit far back, and that's just to ensure that I have the right volume of material there for the collar. And I need the tang beyond that to be 2 1/4 inches long in order to get all the curves in there. So that marked that second point, and then I will add 1.5 inches to be upset, and that will allow me to create the scarf. And in fact I decided to add an extra 1/2 inch to that, so 2 inches, in order to upset that end. Now the end of the upset, the inner end of the upset, I will mark off discreetly with a centre dot, and that will save me upsetting too much beyond that mark. So it's all been cut down now, and this is carbon steel, so you want to be careful how you heat this. And I take a while to heat it up, just to ensure that I don't heat up where I don't want to upset too much. Because obviously this is carbon steel, like I just said, so you don't want to be quenching it off to get a short heat. And then it's just a case of upsetting it. So once you've got a bit of chunk there, just put a slight bend on it, facing towards the crest of the triangular section blade, and just start upsetting that back to partially create an upset corner. So I'm coming downwards here, and it's pushing the material into the face of the anvil. So, and I have upset a little bit beyond that centre dot, and that's just to compensate for any wastage I get from the welding process. So, but just take your time. And be careful not to bend it too much where it's cold, because you will get cracks in your metalwork. And just make sure that it's coming out nice and straight. So at that stage I will put my scarfing lines. So you want to avoid any shearing planes, you want welding planes, so I'm tapering it towards the top of the scarf. and then coming onto the underside of the scarf to just flatten and spread out that material on the bottom side, and that helps contribute towards creating a welding plane. As you can see, this is now a trapezius shape. So then the final thing you can do is just stick a taper on the end, like you see in traditional scarves. So I've never done one of these before. I am completely making it up as I'm going along. However, my experience tells me that this should work. We will try and avoid a repetition of the infamous SEAX video, which failed in dramatic fashion. So once you got this foot, which has come out quite nice, you then want to start creating the material for the socket. So the sockets on these bayonets were wrought iron as opposed to the carbon steel of the blade. So I'm using the tail end of a paddle rod from the canal. Now this is fairly poor quality wrought iron, and it's got a slotted eye in the middle, as you can see. So I need to weld this up. And I am also going to refine the iron a little bit. So I'm going to take a first pass at a welding heat to close that eye and make sure I'm not going to get any delamination in this, because that would be quite awkward later on. So I am just flattening this and drawing it out. And then, same as making a pattern welded billet, I will cut halfway through the material with a chisel. And then I will fold it over. And folding of this was a little bit awkward, mainly because I've got that tiny little stub to hold on to. Now you can use your Pritchell hole for this, as I do quite regularly. Doesn't really matter if you damage the bottom bit because that's going to be cut off anyway. So just fold that over and get it to a welding heat and weld it up. So this is wrought iron, so you want a snowball heat with a molten surface. Not using any flux because wrought iron is pretty much self-fluxing anyway. And I tend to only flux carbon steels anyway. And I folded it twice in order to refine the grain of this iron. So you will notice you lose a fair amount of volume from doing this to wrought iron, and that's because you're pushing out the slag and impurities from the grain. So then I put my drawing die on the power hammer. This is just a piece of handrail with a welded frame around it. And I will spread that material out. So I spread it out to about 65mm, which is more than it needs to be, because we want a 19mm internal diameter socket. So ideally you want about 60mm. However, the thickness, the final thickness, will be 2mm, so I am leaving the billet thickness as 5 to 6mm, and that will give me some grinding work to do, but it will ensure that I have a nice accurate socket. So once I've spread it out to 60mm, I will then bring it back down to 55mm. Under the power hammer again, it's much quicker like this. And then just make sure it's even all the way around. And here we have the billet prepared to be turned into a socket. It's nice even thickness, nice even section, and it is refined iron. So this is how the blade will be welded to this. Now, if you look at the transition between the tang and the scarf, you will see that I have a shear plane here. So what I will do is I will just take 15mm off the end of the wrought iron billet, and that is just purely arbitrary. I just want to get that mankiness off the end where it hasn't quite welded and where it's a bit mucky. And I will actually cut out a 10mm tab from the centre of the billet. Now this tab will come up behind the bayonet tang and will support the scarf there, and that will allow me to close that up where otherwise I might end up with a gall. So in order to do this, I will do a set down on this tab. I'm using the radius section of the anvil for this because I don't want to create any galling when I fold it over in a second. I'm just forging that out to a square taper. I'll bring it down to a reasonably fine point so that I don't create again any shearing planes rather than welding planes. So then just give it a tap over, and you then want to square it off. Now I went over to the pritchel hole for this and then missed the action on camera, so I do apologise for that, but the end result is that I've got a nice upset square corner on it. So then I will actually forge it back down and get it to a matching angle vis-a-vis the scarf on the blade, so that the two can combine without actually impeding each other, like so. So this tab will then be, once the scarf has been set to the billet, that tab will then be wrapped slightly around and welded up itself. So as you can see, it seats quite nicely. It also helps in locating the blade centrally to the socket. And there we have it. So that's it for this week's video. Next week we will weld up both of these parts, and we will weld up the socket as well. So thanks a lot for watching, guys. If you enjoy, please leave a like or subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you enjoy these videos quite a lot, please consider donating to Patreon. Every penny helps towards making these videos. Here is my current list of splendid Patreon donors. Thanks a lot, guys. You are helping me make all these interesting projects. Without you guys, we'd be just doing S-hooks and stuff. So thanks a lot, and I will see you next week on the next one.